At 41 years old, Cora Whitfield stood on a rutted road outside Alder Hollow, with $31 sewn into the hem of her only good skirt, a dog at her heel, and not one roof left in the world she could call her own. It was her late husband's brother, Thomas Hale, who had put her out, not with a fist, but with a signed paper, and a cold recitation of debts he swore she owed the family, though everyone in 3 counties knew the debts were his own. All she carried from 18 years of marriage was that $31, a wagon with one bad wheel, and a rust-colored hound named Copper, who pressed his body against her skirts as though he alone understood what had been taken from her. So when old Silas Pratt mentioned, almost as a joke, that the condemned tannery down by Hollow Creek could be had for $12, because that tannery will ruin you, same as it ruined the last 3 fools who touched it, Cora did not laugh. She counted her money, looked at her dog, and said she'd take it. The whole town called it foolish. They did not know that beneath the rotted drying racks out back, something had been waiting 11 years to be found, something that would not only remake Cora Whitfield's life, but set right a wrong the whole town had been quietly bleeding from since before she'd ever arrived. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Cora Whitfield and her faithful dog Copper. If this story of quiet courage, and a dog who wouldn't stop digging, speaks to something in you, tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and let us know if you, too, have ever loved a dog who seemed to know more than he had any right to. Cora had been born Cora Ann Bellwether in the spring of 1846, in a narrow clapboard house that sat behind her father's tannery on the outskirts of a town so small it did not appear on most maps of the Ohio River Valley. Her father, Amos Bellwether, was a tanner by trade, and, in Cora's memory, something closer to a philosopher who happened to work with hides. He believed, and said so often enough, that it became a kind of family scripture, that there was no such thing as a worthless piece of leather, only a piece of leather that had not yet found the hands patient enough to see what it could become. He taught Cora to read the grain of a hide the way other men read weather, to know by smell alone whether a batch of bark liquor had reached the right strength for tanning, to test the temper of leather between her fingers until she could tell, blindfolded, whether it would hold a stitch or crack under the first hard rain. Her mother had died when Cora was 9, and so it was her father's tannery that raised her. The sour earthy smell of oak bark and lime pits, the long wooden paddles stirring vats the color of strong tea, the rhythm of scraping and stretching and waiting that taught a girl patience before she had a word for it. Amos never once suggested that this was strange work for a daughter. He handed her tools the way another father might hand down a name. In the mornings before the yard woke fully to its work, Amos would walk the rows of stretching frames with young Cora trailing at his elbow, naming the hides the way some men name their horses, this one destined for a farmer's harness, that one too fine-grained for anything but a gentleman's boot, another ruined beyond saving by a careless skinning knife, and fit only to be cut down small, and used where its flaws would never show. He taught her that ruin was rarely total, and that waste was, in his estimation, the greater sin. She learned to boil bark liquor to the color of strong tea, and no darker, to judge by the smell of a lime pit, whether the hair would slip free easily, or need another day's soak, to recognize in the particular give of a hide beneath her palm, whether the tanning had gone deep enough to last a lifetime, or only deep enough to fool a buyer for a season. These were not lessons she ever expected to need again, once she married and left the tannery for a freighter's house. And yet she carried them anyway. The way a person carries an accent from childhood, long after they have moved away from the place that gave it to them, unaware of how deeply it has settled into the bone, until circumstance calls it back out. It was in that tannery, when Cora was 17, that she first understood the particular ache of watching someone else claim credit for her father's honest labor. A merchant named Elias Bramwell, newly arrived from the East with soft hands and a silver tongue, had begun buying up leather goods cheap from small tanners, and reselling them at triple the price in the cities, cutting out the very craftsmen who made the goods worth buying at all. Amos refused to sell to him at his terms, calling him, in Cora's hearing, a man who tans nothing, and skins everyone. Bramwell smiled at the insult, and said, softly, that he would remember it. Cora did not think much of the exchange at the time. She was 17, and there was a wedding on her mind, for it was that same autumn that a freight hauler named Everett Hale first came through with a train of wagons bound for the river landing, and stopped to have a harness mended, and stayed to court the tanner's daughter with a patience that matched her own. Everett was not a wealthy man, but he was a steady one, and he loved her the way her father loved a well-cured hide, for what she already was, not for what he hoped to make of her. He courted her through that autumn with a patience she recognized as kin to her own, riding out from the river landing whenever his freight runs allowed, bringing her small useless gifts, a ribbon, a tin of peppermints, once a smooth river stone he swore looked like her profile if you held it at the right angle and squinted, which made her laugh despite herself. They married in the spring of 1868, in the small church her father had helped raise the timbers for, and Cora left her father's tanyard for a small house near Alder Hollow, a town built on the freight trade along the old post road, where Everett's family ran a modest hauling business moving goods between the river landing and the inland farms. It was there, 3 years into her marriage, on a night when the first hard frost had settled early and mean over the valley, that a half-starved red hound pup wandered into her yard, ribs showing plainly beneath a coat matted with burrs, one ear torn and healed crooked, and refused to leave no matter how many times she shooed him toward the road. She told herself she only meant to feed him the once, out of a Christian pity that cost her nothing, but the pup returned the next evening, and the one after that, until feeding him became habit, and habit, in the way of such things, quietly became love, before she had given herself permission to feel it. She named him Copper, for the way his coat caught firelight the color of a new penny left too long near a stove, and from that first winter on, he slept across her doorway, as if he had appointed himself her personal watchman, growling low at strangers and softening instantly to nothing at the sound of her voice. Everett used to say that dog loved Cora the way some men love God, without asking a single question about whether it was deserved, and without needing an answer either. In the years that followed, as Cora bore no children but grew skilled in her own right, at mending harness leather and stretching hides for Everett's freight business, sitting many long evenings with an awl and waxed thread, while Everett totaled his ledgers at the same table, it was Copper who filled the quiet corners of the house that might otherwise have ached with the absence of a child's noise. He walked her to the well and back every morning without being asked, positioned himself at her feet whenever she sat to sew, and lay his head heavy and warm across her lap on the nights when grief or worry kept sleep at a distance. Her father died in the winter of 1879, following a long illness, during which Cora had nursed him herself, riding the 2 days to his tanyard and back, as often as her own household allowed. And it was Copper, not any human soul, who sat pressed against her side, through the worst of that morning, through nights she could not have named what she needed, even if someone had thought to ask. It was in that season of grief that Cora came to believe, quietly, and without requiring anyone else to agree with her, that some dogs are sent into a life, rather than simply found wandering in a yard, arriving exactly when a person's heart has grown too heavy to carry entirely alone. The fall, when it came, arrived not as a single blow, but as a slow collapse, that Cora did not see clearly until it had already buried her. Everett's freight business had grown reliant on credit extended by the Alder Hollow Trust, a modest bank that had, in recent years, come under the quiet influence of a man Cora recognized the moment she saw him step off the coach in 1884, Elias Bramwell, older now, silvered at the temples, dressed like a man who had never once had dirt under his fingernails, and possessed of the same soft, patient smile he'd worn the day her father insulted him in the tanyard some 17 years before. Bramwell had not forgotten. He had, if anything, grown more comfortable in his patience, content to wait years for a debt to come due at the worst possible moment, the way a man might set a trap, and then simply go about his business, confident the ground would eventually give way beneath someone's careless foot. Everett had borrowed against 2 wagons and a barn to expand his hauling routes further up the valley, trusting the bank's terms as any honest man trusts a signed paper, never once suspecting that Bramwell had quietly bought controlling interest in the Alder Hollow Trust, specifically to have leverage over the very families who had once shamed him in tanyards and shops up and down the valley, when he'd first arrived poor in reputation, if not in coin. Cora noticed, in hindsight, small signs she had been too occupied to read at the time. The way the bank's terms tightened almost imperceptibly year over year. The way Bramwell always seemed to know, when he passed Everett on the road, exactly which routes were struggling and which wagons needed repair, as though he kept a private ledger of every family's weaknesses, the way her father had once kept a ledger of Hyde's. She would come to understand, far too late to spare her husband any of it, that Bramwell had been patient in the truest and cruelest sense of the word, content to let a decade pass if it meant the debt would finally come due at a moment when a family had nothing left to fight it with. In the spring of 1886, Everett was killed when a loaded freight wagon overturned on the steep grade above Hollow Creek, the same creek that ran behind the old tannery, thrown from the seat, while trying to hold a spooked team steady on a road slicked by 3 days of rain. Cora heard the news from a freighter's boy who arrived at her door white-faced and out of breath, and she remembered afterward almost nothing of the days that followed, except the constant, solid warmth of copper pressed against her side, refusing to leave her even to eat, as though he understood in whatever way a dog understands such things, that his job now was simply not to let her be alone with it. Her grief had not even had time to settle properly into her bones before Thomas Hale, Everett's younger brother, arrived at her door with the bank's paperwork already signed, and a claim that the family debts Bramwell's bank had structured, though neither Thomas nor Cora yet understood it, to come due within weeks of Everett's death, were now Cora's sole responsibility to satisfy, or else the family name and the family land would be forfeit together. Thomas, weak-willed and eager to please a bank that held notes on his own modest holdings as well, chose the family land over his brother's widow, and told Cora, without quite meeting her eyes, that it would be easier for everyone if she simply signed the house over and went to stay with distant cousins 2 counties east, who had offered, out of duty rather than warmth, to take her in. Cora listened to the whole proposal in silence, Copper growling low and steady at Thomas's boots the entire time, as though he alone in the room understood the true shape of what was being asked. She refused the cousins. She signed only what the law absolutely forced her to sign, took the $31 that remained of her own mending money savings hidden separately from the household accounts, loaded what little fit into one wagon whose wheel was already threatening to give out on the very first rutted mile, called Copper up beside her on the seat, and drove away from the only home she'd had in 18 years without once looking back, because she had learned from her father, standing among his ruined and rescued hides, that looking back at a ruin never once made it less ruined. It was 3 days later, the wagon wheel finally splintering for good on the road into Alder Hollow proper, a different, larger Alder Hollow than the outlying farm she'd lived on, the town center itself, where she had occasion to do business but had never called home, that Cora found herself standing outside the old Pruitt tannery, with Silas Pratt chuckling beside her about the curse the place seemed to carry. The tannery had belonged, some 11 years back, to a quiet, meticulous craftsman named Josiah Pruitt, who had built it up from nothing, and then, for reasons no one in town could quite agree on, sold it in a hurry, took his family west, and never wrote back to anyone. The 2 owners after him had fared worse. One lost the building to a fire that scorched the drying shed, but left the main structure standing. The next sank badly into debt, and drank himself into an early grave, leaving the property to sit condemned and cobwebbed for the better part of 4 years, avoided by townsfolk who had started to say, half in jest, and half in genuine unease, that the tannery would ruin anyone fool enough to touch it. Bramwell's bank held the paper on it now, same as it held paper on half the town, and was glad enough to sell it cheap and be rid of the reputation attached to it. $12, Silas said. Cora had that much and a little more. She looked at the sagging roofline, the creek running cold and clear behind it, the drying racks standing skeletal in the yard, like the ribs of some old beast, and she looked at Copper, who had already trotted ahead of her through the gate, and stood sniffing intently at the base of those very racks, with his tail gone stiff and alert, in a way she recognized from years of watching him hunt. She paid the $12 that same afternoon. The first days in the tannery were a lesson in humility. Rain had gotten into one corner of the roof, the lime pits were dry and cracked, and the smell of long neglect hung over everything like a held breath. But Cora's hands remembered what her father had taught them, and she moved through the building the way a musician moves through a familiar song, finding the good bones of the place beneath its decay. It was on her third evening there, while she was clearing brush from around the drying racks in the fading light, that Copper began to behave in a way that stopped her cold. He had wandered to the far corner of the shed, near the last standing rack, and begun to dig with a single-minded intensity she had only ever seen from him when he'd caught the scent of something he refused to abandon. She called him off twice, and twice he returned to the same spot, whining low in his throat, pawing at the packed earth beneath the rack's warped wooden legs, until his claws had scraped a shallow trench. Cora, who had learned long ago that Copper's instincts were rarely wrong, knelt beside him with a lantern, and began, carefully, to dig where he had dug. What she found that first evening was not the whole of it, only a corner of a metal box, rusted at the seams, buried perhaps 18 inches down beneath the rack's foundation stone. She could not free it fully before darkness made the work too difficult to continue safely, and so she covered it back over, said a quiet prayer of thanks to whatever instinct in her dog had led her to it, and spent a sleepless night wondering what Josiah Pruitt might have buried, and why he had left in such a hurry that he never came back for it. The deepening mystery began in earnest the following morning, when Cora and Copper together, the dog circling and barking encouragement, as though he understood perfectly well the importance of the task, worked the box free of the earth that had held it for over a decade. It was heavier than its size suggested, bound with a strap gone brittle with age, and when Cora finally forced the rusted latch, she found inside not gold, as her wildest hope had briefly allowed her to imagine, but something in its way more valuable. A leather-bound ledger, water-stained but legible, wrapped in oiled cloth that had preserved most of its pages, and beneath the ledger, wrapped separately, a modest but real sum in gold and silver coin, perhaps $300 in all, along with a short letter addressed to no one in particular, written in a careful, worried hand. The ledger told a story Cora read twice through by lantern light, before she trusted her own understanding of it. Copper curled against her feet the whole while as though standing a second watch over what he had already guarded once beneath the earth. Josiah Pruitt had not simply run a tannery. He had, in the years before Bramwell's bank tightened its grip on the town, served as the informal keeper of a mutual relief fund that the tanners, freighters, and small tradesmen of Alder Hollow had built together over better than 2 decades. A common purse, contributed to willingly by dozens of working families, a few coins at a time. Meant to catch widows, and orphans, and injured men when hard luck struck, administered outside the reach of any single bank, precisely because the town's founders had lived through enough bank failures and foreclosures elsewhere not to trust any single institution with poor men's savings. Pruitt, trusted by the whole community for his honesty and his careful hand with figures, had kept the fund's records himself, and held a portion of its coin hidden at his own tannery for safekeeping, the rest distributed in smaller caches among a handful of other trusted families, so that no single misfortune could wipe it out entirely. The ledger's earlier entries were plain and businesslike, recording contributions and disbursements in the same steady hand, $3 to the Whitcombs after a barn fire, a small sum to see the Ostrander boy through a broken leg, modest relief to a widow whose husband had drowned crossing the river at flood stage. But the later entries, written in a hand grown increasingly anxious and cramped, described a newly arrived banker, Elias Bramwell, named outright, his name pressed so hard into the page in places that the nib had nearly torn through, who had begun pressuring Pruitt to fold the relief fund's remaining assets into the newly formed Alder Hollow Trust, claiming it would be safer under proper banking oversight, and who had grown steadily more threatening as Pruitt continued to refuse, hinting more than once that he could make life very difficult indeed for a tradesman who displeased the only bank in a town increasingly dependent on its credit. The final entry, dated mere days before Pruitt's sudden and unexplained departure west, recorded his growing fear that Bramwell intended to seize the fund outright by some manufactured claim of paper and law, rather than by honest request, and his decision, made in evident haste, to bury what remained of the fund's coin beneath his own drying racks, along with the true and complete accounting of it, until such time as it was safe to retrieve, a day that through some accident of fate, threat or simple fear for his family's safety, had simply never come. Pruitt had fled, Cora came to believe, not from failure or disgrace, but from a threat too large for one honest tradesman to fight alone against a man who already owned the only bank willing to lend in the county, and in the haste of protecting his wife and children he had left behind, unwittingly, the very proof that could one day set right the wrong done to the town he'd been forced to abandon without ever explaining why. Word travels fast in a town the size of Alder Hollow, and it was not 2 weeks before Elias Bramwell himself came calling at the Tannery, dressed as immaculately as ever despite the dust of the road, his soft smile fixed carefully in place, his eyes moving over the property with the proprietary interest of a man who believed everything eventually belonged to him, if he simply waited long enough. He had heard, he said, resting one polished boot on the fence rail, with studied casualness, that the new owner had been digging around the old foundations, and he wished only to offer, out of purely neighborly concern, to buy the tannery back from her, at a generous price, given its unfortunate history, and the no doubt considerable difficulties a woman alone might face, maintaining such a large and troublesome property. Cora, who had by then spent 3 full weeks studying Pruitt's ledger by lantern light, until she knew its entries, as well as she knew her own name, understood at once what he was truly asking beneath the courteous words, and declined him just as politely, watching something cold and hard move briefly behind his eyes, before the smile smoothed back over it, like water closing over a dropped stone. In the days that followed, the conflict Cora had quietly feared arrived in earnest, and from several directions at once. Bramwell called in a technicality on the tannery's original condemnation papers through a lawyer in the county seat, questioning aloud in the local paper whether Cora's $12 purchase had even been legally sound to begin with, and suggesting the property might need to revert to the bank pending review. He spread quiet word through the town, in the careful, deniable way of a man who never dirtied his own hands with gossip, that the widow at the old tannery had been seen digging up something unnatural out back, graves, some whispered, or bones, feeding the old superstition that the place was cursed, and reminding anyone who'd forgotten that 3 owners before her had all come to ruin there. He sent Thomas Hale himself, red-faced and unable to meet Cora's eyes, to warn her plainly that the bank could make her remaining debts she did not in truth owe, but which Bramwell's lawyers could tangle her in for years regardless, very painful indeed, if she did not simply agree to sell and move along quietly. Copper, through all of it, would not let a single stranger from the bank's office anywhere near the drying shed, without planting himself low growling, and entirely immovable between the visitor and the ground he had once dug with his own claws, as though some animal sense in him understood exactly what still mattered about that patch of earth, and exactly which men meant to take it from her, by whatever crooked means came easiest to hand. It was Cora's old habit of patience, learned at her father's tannery among hides that could not be rushed toward what they were meant to become, that carried her through the weeks of pressure without breaking, where a less steady woman might well have folded. She did not confront Bramwell directly, not yet, understanding as her father had taught her that a hide worked too soon simply tears. Instead, she spent her evenings, after the day's tannery chores were finished, going door to door through Alder Hollow and the outlying farms with Copper trotting patient at her heel, quietly asking the older families, tanners, freighters, blacksmiths, the same trades Pruitt's ledger named as contributors, whether they remembered a common relief purse from years back, and watching more than one weathered face soften with recognition and old grief as they searched trunks and Bible pages for a receipt slip they'd nearly forgotten they still kept. She gathered 11 such slips in all, each one bearing a name, a date, and a sum that matched some line in Pruitt's careful hand almost to the penny, and she wrapped them together with the ledger itself in oiled cloth, before riding 2 full days to the county seat. There she sought out a circuit judge named Ezra Holt, a spare, unhurried man with a reputation for honesty that even Bramwell's considerable money had not yet managed to touch, and laid the whole matter before him without embellishment. The ledger, the buried coin as physical proof the fund had been real, and the 11 corroborating receipts from families who had no reason under heaven to conspire together in a lie. Judge Holt read through the material twice by his own lamp before he spoke, and when he did, it was to say only that he had wondered for some years why so many small tradesmen up and down that valley seemed to sink so suddenly into debt not long after Bramwell's bank extended them credit, and that he would be glad, finally, of the evidence to ask the man himself. He issued a summons requiring Bramwell to answer publicly for the relief fund's disappearance, and for whatever pressure he had placed on Josiah Pruitt some 11 years before. When the day of reckoning came, held in the open air outside the county courthouse, because half of Alder Hollow, and no small number from neighboring towns, turned out to watch, the crowd stood close, despite a thin cold rain, unwilling to miss what they sensed was coming. It was Cora who stood before them, and read Pruitt's final ledger entry aloud, her voice steady despite the memory of everything the last 2 years had cost her, pausing once when it caught in her throat at the line describing Pruitt's fear for his own family, and it was Copper who sat pressed against her skirts through the whole proceeding, still and dignified, as though he understood that his part in this particular hunt was now to simply stand guard over the truth, rather than dig for it. Bramwell, cornered publicly by evidence he could not simply out-talk or outwait, tried first to claim the ledger a forgery, then that the fund had never truly existed, and finally, as the 11 receipt holders stepped forward one by one to be recognized by the judge, fell into a silence that told the crowd everything his words no longer could. He was ordered to restore the fund's full value with years of accrued interest paid from his own considerable fortune, forced to relinquish his controlling interest in the Alder Hollow Trust as part of the settlement, and he left the county seat that same week by the evening coach, alone, with none of the soft smile that had carried him so successfully through so many years of quiet theft. The climax of the matter was not, in the end, Bramwell's disgrace, satisfying as that was to witness, but what came after it, in the slower and quieter work of setting things right. Cora used a portion of the recovered fund, with the blessing of the very families whose parents and grandparents had built it, to restore the tannery properly through that whole summer, repairing the roof timber by timber, refilling the lime pits, rebuilding the drying racks stronger and truer than before with good seasoned oak, and reopened it, not as her own private enterprise alone, but as a working relief tannery in the spirit Pruitt had first intended, employing 3 widows of the town, including Josiah Pruitt's own sister-in-law who had never left Alder Hollow, and who wept quietly the first morning she stepped through the tannery doors again after so many years. Cora trained 2 boys left fatherless by accidents on the very freight roads Everett had once worked, teaching them the same patient lessons her own father had once taught her about reading the grain of a hide, and trusting work that could not be rushed. She kept, framed on the tannery's inner wall, where every visitor and every worker could see it plainly, the original page of Pruitt's ledger, describing the fund's founding purpose in his own careful hand, so that no one who labored there could ever forget what the place was truly meant to be for, nor how close it had come to being lost entirely to one man's patient greed. The town, which had once whispered that the tannery would ruin anyone foolish enough to touch it, began instead to say that it had been the making of Cora Whitfield, and she let them say it without correction, because she carried within her the truer version of the story. That it had been the ruin of a good man's fear, buried alongside his coin for 11 long years, finally undone at last, 11 years late but not one day too late, by a widow with nothing left to lose and a dog who simply would not stop digging. And so the tannery that everyone swore would ruin her became, in the end, the very thing that restored her, and restored a whole town's quiet, buried trust besides, proving the old warning wrong in the most complete way imaginable. Cora often thought, in the years that followed, sitting some evening on the porch of the little house she eventually built beside the tannery, with copper graying gently at the muzzle, but still faithful at her feet, of her father's old saying, that no leather is worthless, only unfound by patient hands, and she came to believe the same was true of people, and of whole towns besides. That ruin and restoration often share the very same ground, the very same buried foundation, waiting only for someone stubborn enough, and a dog loyal enough, to dig until the truth finally comes up into the light where it belongs. She never forgot, not for one single year that remained to her, that it was Copper who found it first, Copper who would not be called off no matter how firmly she scolded him, Copper who seemed to know, in whatever wordless way dogs know such things, that some buried wrongs are simply waiting, patient as bark liquor steeping slow in a vat, for someone who loves enough to go looking. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with us, and with Cora and Copper tonight. If their story moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who needs a reminder that overlooked things, and overlooked people, often hold more worth than anyone around them has bothered to notice. We'll leave you with this to sit with before you go. What is the one thing in your own life that everyone warned you would ruin you, but that turned out, quietly, to be your making instead? Until next time, stay close,